It's March the 2nd, 1974. We're in Barcelona, in Spain, and 25-year-old Salvador Puig Antic is living out his last hours on Earth. As a committed anti-fascist and an anarchist militant, Salvador has always been an enemy of Francisco Franco's regime, but when a shootout with the police resulted in the death of an officer, his fate was sealed. Now, he has to die. It's around 9 a.m. when Puig is led into the parcel room at Barcelona's La Modelo prison. Within this makeshift execution chamber is the machine that will end his life. The garrote. His hands and feet are bound and he's forced into a sitting position, strapped to a pole in the middle of the room. A metal collar is then fastened around his neck. A few twists of the handle at the back of the collar will do the job. His neck will be broken, his air supply will be cut off, and death will come swiftly. But there's a problem. Salvador's executioner has been drinking. At the rear of the contraption, he grapples clumsily with the handle. As the minutes tick by, Salvador remains conscious. He bucks and writhes against his constraints. The prison guards and officials observing the execution look away in disgust. It was not supposed to be like this. Those who do keep their eyes on Puig see his face changing colour. It turns a deep puce red as his blood vessels dilate. His eyes bulge, his tongue swells in his mouth. The young man's bound hands open and close in convulsion. His chest heaves in a futile attempt to draw breath. The executioner is still working away at the handle. He twists it further and further, wondering why Salvador's neck is not yet broken. As well as tightening the collar, each twist of the handle should drive a screw into the victim's spinal column. This crushes the vertebrae and hastens death. But in his drunkenness, the executioner has not aligned the collar properly. For poor Salvador, the screw is simply driving its way into his flesh. And so this screw compounds his final agonies, rather than bringing them mercifully to an end. Finally, at 9:40 a.m., 20 minutes after the ordeal began, Salvador is pronounced dead. Around the same time, 60 miles down the coast in Tarragona, George Michael Welzel receives the same pronouncement. Together, they are the last of the anacortados. They're the last victims of the garrote, at least in Spain. At its core, garroting was rather simple. To live, humans need air. That air has to flow down the windpipe into the lungs, and blocking the windpipe means stopping that flow of air. Stopping that flow of air means death. This simplicity is probably why garroting has been around for thousands of years. Publius Cornelius Lentulus apparently met this fate in 63 BC after the failed Catilinarian plot against Rome's consuls. 17 years later, Gallic leader Vercingetorix died in the same way, after surrendering to Julius Caesar. These early garrotings didn't involve sophisticated collars and screws. They simply used a strong cord or ligature to strangle the life from the victim. It was ultimately in Spain, though, where garroting really found its place in the judicial repertoire, both at home and abroad. The garrote became a tool of religious and political control. From 1478 onwards, the Spanish Inquisition made sure the Iberian Peninsula stayed nice and Catholic, just the way monarchs Ferdinand II and Isabella of Castile liked it. These days, of course, the Inquisition is known for its astonishing brutality and for the abject misery it inflicted on its victims. But this didn't mean that inquisitors didn't have a softer side. If heretics converted to Christianity after they'd been convicted, they were offered the gentle punishment of the garrote. This was a swift and simple way to send them off to another trial, this time before St. Peter at the pearly gates. Of course, gentle is a relative term. It's only gentle when you consider the alternative, which is being burnt alive. Thousands of miles away to the west, though, as Spanish forces got busy subjugating the peoples of South America, they brought their garrotes with them. One of the most famous indigenous victims of the garrote is the Incan ruler Atahualpa. After his capture by Francisco Pizarro, Atahualpa was offered a way to save his own life. As a ransom, he must fill one room with gold and another with silver. If he did not do this, he would die. In the end, he did do this. Both rooms were filled. But he was sentenced to death anyway. He was supposed to be burned alive, but in the end he was just garroted. Perhaps this was a thank you for providing all that loot. Atahualpa's execution mirrored the ways garrotes were used elsewhere in the world. In Qing Dynasty China, between the 17th and 20th centuries, the gongxiang, or bowstring, execution method was used to end the lives of nobles and other elites. The silk and deerhide bowstrings could be incredibly strong and were very useful for asphyxiation. They also kept the body of the condemned intact, which would ease their transition between this world and the next. Having your head chopped off, by contrast, could be a real inconvenience in the afterlife. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, garroting was also used for high-ranking prisoners, although the Ottomans weren't so bothered about keeping the body intact. Osman II was captured and imprisoned during a Janissary uprising in 1622, and then executed with the garrote. They then cut off his nose and one ear. In 1683, Sultan Mehmed IV ordered the death of Kara Mustafa after his failure at the Battle of Vienna. Though disgraced, Mustafa was still a military commander and a former Grand Vizier. It was decided that he would die a dignified death, so he was garroted with a silk scarf. Back in Spain, however, there wasn't so much concern for the class or status of the victim. By the 19th century, reforms of the penal code made capital punishment more civilized. Garroting replaced methods like beheading as the primary form of execution in Spain, and a special collar was even developed for the purpose. This made the whole thing much easier, or at least it was much easier for the executioner. The condemned person would be placed upon a stool, then strapped against a post, holding them upright and in position. The metal collar would then be fastened around their neck. The rear portion of the collar would be attached directly to the pole, so that the victim could not move. A screw would then be threaded through the back of the collar and tightened with a handle. This handle was often just a long stick. Basically anything that could give the executioner a bit of leverage would do. Some variations could be more bloody, but arguably more humane. For example, executioners might attach a sharp implement to the inside of the collar, like a knife blade. This would bring about death more quickly, but likely made quite a bit of mess. By 1828, garroting was so popular that it became the only method of civilian execution in Spain. Of the 720 men and 16 women executed in Spain during the 19th century, the majority met their end with the garrote. Firing squads were used for military-related or political offences. It seems the efficiency of the Spanish method won it some fans. In 1874, garroting was even discussed in the British House of Lords as a possible alternative to hanging. Lord Dunsany related the story of half-hanged Meg, who was only discovered to be still alive while her body was being dissected. He was probably referring to Margaret Dixon, who was hanged for murder in 1721, but survived. This kind of thing was rare, but admittedly pretty horrific. Dunsany believed garroting would banish it for good, but his fellow lords didn't agree, and the practice was never adopted in Britain. Spain stopped garroting people in public in 1898, but the practice itself continued long into the 20th century. From 1900 to the eve of civil war in 1935, 94 men and 2 women were garroted. Spain's fascist dictator, Francisco Franco, was a big fan of this execution method. 110 men and 3 women died this way between 1939 and Franco's death in 1975. But as we've seen with Salvador Puig Antic, even such a well-practiced and long-established method of execution did not always go to plan. On May 19, 1959, 31-year-old Pilar Prades Exposito was led into a prison courtyard in Valencia and strapped into the device that would take her life. Pilar was scheduled to die at 6 a.m., but at almost 8 a.m. she was still alive. A housekeeper by trade, Pilar was convicted of poisoning her employer, Adela Pascual, but the evidence against her was based on coincidence and hearsay. In the end, it was a bottle of poison found in her possession that sealed the conviction. But this poison was common ant killer, a substance that most housekeepers would have used around the time. This meant that there was a real possibility of a pardon, so her execution was delayed by 2 hours. Pilar remained in a sort of limbo. She was not yet dead, but time was rapidly running out. To complicate matters further, her executioner was having second thoughts. Antonio Lopez Guerra, also known as Antonio Lopez Sierra, was experienced in his role. He'd arrived at 10 p.m. the previous night and set about preparing the courtyard along with the grim machinery of his trade. But then he met with the prisoner and discovered she was a woman. Antonio's professionalism melted away. In his own words, executing a woman is worse than executing 30 men. Having to do it with a woman is the hardest thing, especially a young girl with such pale skin like that. Pilar sensed Antonio's misgivings. Perhaps she believed she'd found a way out. Antonio remembered later. She asked me if I had a wife, if I had a daughter. I said yes. So she asked me, why was I in such a hurry? Why did I want to kill her so much? In fact, Antonio did not want to kill Pilar. Time and time again, he refused to go through with it. As the clock ticked down towards morning, the prison authorities appealed to Antonio's sense of civic duty, and when that failed, they leveraged his love of alcohol. The latter approach did the trick. By 8 a.m., Antonio was emboldened by a few glasses of cognac and ready to go. What's more, it was clear that the pardon was not going to appear. The morning sun streamed into the courtyard as Pilar was led out into it one final time. Looking upon the instrument of her death, she was shaken to her very core. She became increasingly desperate. I'm very young. I don't want to be killed. It no longer mattered what Pilar did or did not want. It took 1.5 turns of the handle for Antonio to end her life. No family members or friends came to collect her remains. Pilar Prades Exposito was the last woman to die by the garrote in Spain, but the process would continue for 15 more years until it ended with the executions of Salvador Puig Antich and George Michael Welzel in March 1974. The trauma of the Exposito execution had obviously not affected Antonio Lopez too badly. He was back in the hot seat in 1974 and was ready to botch the execution of Salvador Puig Antich. Ironically, once again, due to his fondness for alcohol. Outwardly, the agonized end of Puig Antich didn't bother Lopez much either. After all, Lopez was an avowed fascist who'd fought for Franco in the Civil War and then volunteered with the German Blue Division to fight the Soviets in World War II. What was one more dead anti-fascist to him? Inwardly, though, he may have been feeling the strain. Even this loyal servant of the regime needed a bit of booze to get the job done. And in fact, this was not unusual for Lopez, as his son Candido remembered in 2011. My father gave the impression that he was a tough guy, but I can assure you that when he came back from executing somebody, he was always drunk. Perhaps the brutality of the death penalty isn't just inflicted on the victims who suffer it, but also in the fact that it makes monsters of men, or gives monstrous men a handsome living.